Süddeutsche Zeitung Germany, Christoph Neidhardt. Maybe just to follow up what you said right now, I mean, you have this stigmatization here in Japan with the survivors of the nuclear attacks to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My question is a follow-up to Richard's question. In the outer evacuation zone, you have some 10,000 people. Now, Western European experts say to stay indoors and close the windows is a good protection for up to maybe 48 hours. These people are indoors for 17 days or so. The Japanese government says they are still protected. What's your opinion? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the protection, what are we protecting against by staying indoors? I mean, we're protecting against ambient radiation. So the comparator, of course, is you're indoors in your house, and if there's a certain radiation level outside, or you're outside. That's the issue. So that degree of protection is not time dependent. So if the radiation source is a radioactive cloud passing by, it's operational when the cloud passes by, and when if it's the soil, that's what you're protecting from, which is not really the case here, then you're in your house. I think the issue, so that is true, that you can be protected forever by staying in your house. The question is, how do you survive? Okay, how are you going to get food? So someone who's outside is going to be bringing you food so you can stay inside, or we call this cabin fever. People start going nuts, getting nuts from being indoors. So at a certain point, that strategy fails unless you say the purpose of staying indoors is for when there are gaseous releases. Okay, so it's just like the earthquake warnings that you have here on the telephone. That you can lead a normal existence, but when there's a release, if you can either know it or predict it, or it's an intentional release, well then people should go indoors. But obviously it's not possible that they would remain indoors for the amount of time it's going to take to mitigate this accident. Is not measured in days or weeks. It's measured in months, or maybe even years. But so that's not a long-term strategy. But it does work at any given moment. If there's no time limit to it, it's just not a very practical solution on the long term.
Anthony Rowe, Singapore Business Times. My question follows up on what you've just said a moment ago. Last night, I think an official of the TEPCO said that it might take months or even years before this reactor was completely cleaned up, or whatever that means. So, two questions about that. If the situation does in fact take many months at least to resolve, would you expect the levels of radiation, as it is progressively resolved, to fall quite quickly to much less threatening levels? And two, is this a kind of, if the radiation does continue, even at moderate levels, is this a non-linear thing? In other words, as people's bodies are exposed to radiation over a period of months rather than weeks, is that going to raise the level of danger?
No, those are excellent questions. So in the first instance, we have to consider, two things. We have to consider ongoing releases, and we have to consider what is out there already. So once containment is achieved, that will be the end of further releases. When I say containment, I'm using it in the broad sense. I don't mean somebody, with super glue sealing the contained vessel, but I'm speaking in a general sense. Once containment is achieved, provided there is no fuel that cannot be contained. Chernobyl accident, of course, without a containment structure around the fuel, the only containment that could be ultimately provided, I mean, you can douse the reactor core with the boron, and extinguish the chain reaction. But if it's just out there on the ground, then ultimately the only containment is a structure you build around it. Otherwise, it continues to release radiations. So it's not clear at all if sufficient containment can be achieved in the current physical structure. That would be the best situation. If that can't happen, then other solutions will have to be devised, like entombment of the reactor or dismantling of the reactor. I mean, both have been used. The 3 Mile Island reactor was decommissioned, so it's taken apart, and the radioactive parts of it, one tries to deal with them, whereas the Chernobyl reactor was entombed. Entombment sounds great, but it has substantial problems in terms of maintaining the integrity of the structure and things of that nature. So that's part of it. The second part of it, of course, is what's out there already, what's on the ground that is exposing people to radiation risks. It's obviously there are certain hotspots where radiation has been deposited because of a release that coincides either with precipitation or the physical chemical form of the radionuclide favored deposition in certain spots. So those areas that need to be identified and decontaminated. So those are two separate issues. On your point of this second point about the ongoing exposure, I suppose that the good news is that if we consider any dose, we say that people get a dose of radiation, 100 millisieverts or something like that, all of the evidence that we have from animals and very limited experiments, data in humans, is that what's called fractionation of the dose, or giving the same dose over a longer period of time rather than a shorter period of time, is actually favorable with regard to adverse consequences. So you would expect, I mean, the extremes, for example, are the atomic bomb explosions, when all of the radiation exposure occurred in an instant, versus Chernobyl, where the radiation, still continues to be delivered, but most of it was delivered over the first several years. If we compare the cancer risk of those two scenarios, instantaneous high-dose radiation or same dose fractionated, then you would expect fewer cancers because the body has a chance to repair mutational events. And as we discussed at the last meeting, this is up to a certain point. If you go to very, very high doses of radiation, then you just kill cells and you don't have any cancer risk at all. Unfortunately, you just kill people. So you also don't have a cancer risk because nobody's around. So I hope that answered your question.
When coming out freelance, rumors have it that Tokyo's tap water has been contaminated. The water you have been served, is it safe to consume? Or if not, what can be done to purify it?
You mean this one? Well, again, everything is relative. Water is normally radioactive. It contains various radionuclides. It may contain uranium because it comes from the radioactive Earth. So, I mean, it's important. I know you know this, but I'm just saying it's important for all of us to realize that our normal drinking water, pre-accident, is radioactive. It's more radioactive in certain areas and less radioactive in other areas. And we don't, generally speaking, intervene to, and the levels can be rather different, and we don't intervene. We have limits of what's acceptable, but below the limits of what's acceptable, we don't intervene to remove radiation from people's water because the perceived adverse consequences are acceptable. There must be adverse consequences, but the cost, when I say cost, I mean not only economic cost, but the social cost of removing radiation from our drinking water would be unacceptable. And so we live with radioactive water all the time. Then the issue becomes, oh, you know, what's too much radiation in the water? You know, is it 300 becquerels, such as the Japanese government, 300 becquerels per liter. The ICRP, the International Council of Radiation Protection, has a limit of 3,000 becquerels per liter, 10 times more. So, you know, I think that again, these limits, whether you accept 300 or 3,000, firstly, they're arbitrary. They are meant to protect the most sensitive members of the population. They accept, you know, very, very low levels of risk. So, for example, if you take, and this may be useful in trying to explain it, because you have a strong obligation and a difficult task for the people in this room to translate these things to the public. So if we consider food and water, I mean, the standard estimate for the proportion of the population dying from cancer is conservatively about 20%. 10,000 people, if you're following 10,000 people, then 2,000 of them are going to die from cancer. 4,000 of them are going to get cancer, and 2,000 of them are going to die from cancer. And that's the normal, unfortunate, but the normal state of affairs. If you use these action levels, like 5 millisieverts, which is the United States government level of how much extra radiation would you allow in food, cumulative exposure. And that assumes that about somewhere between 10 and 30% of your food is contaminated, because we have alternative sources of water. For example, you drink the tap water, you can drink Perrier or something. We have to make some estimate. People forget to do this, that if you eat spinach, you have multiple sources of spinach. Not all of the spinach you're eating is contaminated. So to make some kind of a reasonable estimate, which is roughly between 10 and 30%. So if you make that estimate of between 10 and 30%, and then you say we're going to let people get 5 millisieverts as a cumulative dose, et cetera, how many extra cancers would you see in those 10,000 people? The answer is about 2. So instead of having 2,000, you'll have 2,002 if you follow these guidelines. Well, you know, if you're one of the 2 people that gets cancer because of that, that's, you know, it's 100% for you. But it shows you how conservative these levels are, and I think that can help people decide, well, I mean, a lot of our behaviors confer a risk which is substantially greater than that kind of a implied risk. I mean, smoking increases your risk of cancer 20-fold. And this is 2 out of 2,000. So we've got a lot of, you know, more dangerous things that we accept quite routinely. So I don't know if that helps at all. But I'm thirsty. I'm going to drink this water in a minute.